A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1. Marley's Ghost. Jacob Marley, the business partner of Ebenezer Scrooge, died 7 years ago. There is no doubt about that. It's important to remember that Marley is dead. His burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, and the undertaker. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail, and Scrooge knew that. How could it be otherwise? They had been partners in London for many years. They were both excellent men of business. Scrooge was his only administrator and his only friend. After Marley's death, his partner continued alone with the business, but both names stood above the office door, Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people who were new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. But he didn't care about the names. He answered to both names. The most important thing for him was the business and making money. Oh, Scrooge was selfish, hard, and a miserly old man. He was cold-hearted and solitary as an oyster. The old sinner was full of secrets and lived a lonely life. The cold within him made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and his voice cross. He carried his own frosty temperature always with him. Even in the summer days, his office was as cold as in winter. No warmth could warm, no wintry could chill him. Nobody ever stopped him on the street to say smiling, "Oh, Mr. Scrooge, how are you?" No beggars asked him for money. No children asked him the time. Even the blind men's dogs were afraid of him. When they saw him coming on, they would pull their owners into doorways. Once upon a time, one Christmas Eve, old Scrooge was working in his office, keeping an eye on his clerk, a small man named Bob Cratchit. It was frosty and cold weather. Although it was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it was quite dark. The candles were flaring in all the office windows. Bob was in a small cell, a sort of tank, copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so much smaller. It looked like one coal. Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, so Bob had to wear his white scarf to warm himself. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God bless you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, Fred. "Bah, humbug!" said Scrooge. His nephew's face was ruddy and handsome. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle?" said Fred with sparkling eyes. "You don't mean that, do you?" "I do," said Scrooge. "What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "What right have you to be sorrowful? You're rich enough," answered Scrooge's nephew. Scrooge said "Bah!" again, and followed it up with "humbug." He had no better answer. "Don't be cross, Uncle," said Fred. "I know I'm cross," replied his uncle, "but I live in a world of fools like you. What is Christmas? It's a time when you spend too much, when you find yourself a year older and not an hour richer." "I've always thought of Christmas as a good time, a kind, forgiving, and pleasant time. It's a time to be kind to other people. The people open their hearts to each other, and they sing a Christmas carol. I can only say, God bless Christmas." The clerk in the tank applauded Fred. Then, realizing his big mistake, he went back to work. But his boss had heard him. "Come on, Uncle. Come and dine with us tomorrow." "No, I won't." "But why, Uncle?" "Because Christmas is humbug. Good afternoon." "I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so cross," said Fred. "Why can't we be friends? I came to see you and invite you, because it's Christmas. So a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left his uncle's office without an angry word. Then the clerk let 2 gentlemen in, and they stood, with their hats off, in Scrooge's office. "Am I speaking to Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" asked one of the gentlemen, holding books and papers in his hand. "My partner died 7 years ago today on Christmas Eve. I'm Mr. Scrooge." "We have no doubt that you're as kind as your partner," said the gentleman. It was true that Scrooge was as mean as his partner. The gentleman continued, taking up his pen. "We should help poor people at this time of the year." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge without moving. Plenty of prisons, said the gentleman. Are there no workhouses? I wish I could say there were not, but there are, sir. How much will you give, sir? Nothing, Scrooge replied. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I don't pay to make other people merry. I pay to support the workhouses and the prisons. But many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, said Scrooge, they had better do it. I'm a busy businessman, as you can see, and it's not my business. So good afternoon, gentlemen. The gentlemen left the room, shaking their heads sadly. Scrooge felt pleased with himself. The fog was like a gray blanket outside. People were hurrying to buy what they needed for the Christmas dinner. Scrooge was about to close the office. Bob put on his hat, and he was about to ask a question to his boss. You'll want all day tomorrow, won't you? Said Scrooge. If it's possible, sir. It's not possible. I'll have to pay you for tomorrow, and it's not fair if you don't work, said Scrooge, and continued. But I think you must have the whole day, but be here very early next morning. The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out to have his dinner. He had his dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. Later, he went home to bed. He lived in the house which had once belonged to his dead partner. It was a dark house in a deserted side of the street. In the darkness of the night, Scrooge finally reached his front door. When he saw the knocker, he was surprised. The knocker was not a knocker anymore. It had become the face of his dead partner, Jacob Marley. It was not an angry reflection of Marley's face, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look. As Scrooge looked fixedly, this phenomenon became a knocker again. Scrooge did not dare show his fear. He only opened the door and walked in. He lighted his candle and looked behind the door. There was nothing on the back of the door except the screws that held the knocker on. So he said, "Poof!" and closed the door with a bang. The sound of the bang echoed through the house like thunder. Then he walked across the hall and slowly up the stairs. Inside the house was too dark that the street lamps couldn't light the entry of the house. But darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. One by one, he controlled all of the rooms. Sitting room and bedroom were safe. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa, nobody in the closet. He was safe now, so he shut his door and locked himself in the room. He changed his clothes and sat down by the fire. It was a very low fire, but it was enough to warm him up. The fireplace was an old one. It had tiles and there were lots of pictures on them, but he could only see Marley's face on every tile. His dead partner's face was everywhere. "Humbug," said he, walking across the room. Then he sat in the chair and he saw the bell on the wall. It was slowly beginning to move. From side to side, its ringing became faster. The other bells in the house started to ring loudly. They rang for half a minute or a minute, but it seemed like an hour to Scrooge. Then the bells stopped ringing at the same moment. Now everything was silent, but suddenly Scrooge heard the cellar door open. He also heard some noises. It was like someone pulling heavy chains across the floor. He had heard of the ghosts in haunted houses. The sound of the chains was coming nearer. It came towards his door. He said, "Humbug," again. "I don't believe in ghosts." But his color changed when he saw the transparent figure come through the heavy door. It came upon him, and he cried at last, "Oh, I know him! It's Marley's ghost!" Marley was in his usual clothes, but he had a long tail. This tail was a long chain of cash boxes, keys, heavy purses, and bank books. The ghost looked at his old partner with his death-cold eyes. Scrooge said to himself that he didn't believe in ghosts, but he knew something strange was happening. "What do you want from me?" "You'll see." "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was," answered the ghost. "Who were you then?" "I was your partner, Jacob Marley, when I was alive." "I don't believe you're real." "Why don't you believe in your senses?" "Because a little thing affects them. You can be a bit of a beef or a piece of potato. Sometimes human bodies make tricks to human mind," said Scrooge, raising his voice. Suddenly the spirit cried frightfully and shook its chain with a great noise. It was getting more and more angry. Scrooge fell upon his knees in fear. He said, "Yes, I see you're real." Then he added, "But why have you come? What is the reason of your return? Say everything, Jacob." "Oh, my dear friend, the spirit of every man who does not behave well and help other people in life has to carry these chains. His spirit has to travel endlessly through the world after his death, and these are the chains that we make for ourselves in our lifetime. You see my chain, and you see that it looks like your chain." Scrooge trembled more and more with these words. He looked around him, but he couldn't see a chain. "My chain was full and heavy as today 7 Christmas Eves ago, but it is a punishment for me now," said Marvin's ghost. Scrooge wanted to hear more about his dead partner's story, so he said, "Old Jacob Marley, please tell me everything." "Oh, what can I tell? I can't stay anywhere for long. I have been traveling for 7 years. You see that there is no rest for me in death. I was a bad man in life, although I had money. I only thought of business and never helped others." Scrooge cried in a loud voice, "But you are a good man of business." "Don't repeat that word to me. I'm traveling on the wings of the wind because of thinking only of business and nothing more," said the ghost. Scrooge asked, "Are you here to make me frightened?" "Listen, I can do anything for you, my friend. I have to go away in a few minutes. I came here only to warn you. Many days I sat invisibly beside you and observed your behaviors. You have the time to change, Ebenezer. You still have a chance. If you don't change, you'll be like me," said the ghost. He had come there to save his friend from the same fate. "You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Thank you for your advice." "You will not see me again. Don't wish to see me again for your own peace after death. But know that 3 spirits will visit you. The first spirit will come tomorrow at 1 o'clock, replied the ghost. "Couldn't I take them all at once, Jacob?" asked Scrooge. "I'm sorry, but you cannot," replied the ghost. "The second spirit will visit you on the next night at the same hour, and the third at midnight the following night. I advise you to remember what I have told you." After this conversation, the window began to open, and the spirit left the room slowly, passing through the door with its heavy tail of chains. Scrooge could only hear a sad crying in the air. The ghost joined the other spirits. When Scrooge looked through the window, he saw that the air was full of spirits. They were all wearing chains and crying. They had made mistakes in their lives, but now it was too late for them. They were endlessly traveling through the world like Marley's ghost. Some of these punished spirits were familiar to Scrooge. Then he closed the window and controlled the door by which the ghost had entered. He wanted to say, "Humbug," as always, but this time stopped at the first syllable. He was so tired, and the hour was so late, that he went straight to bed. Chapter 2. The First of the 3 Spirits. When Scrooge woke up, it was so dark in the room that he couldn't see anything. So he listened to the bell of a neighborhood church. It rang from 6 until 12, then stopped. Scrooge was surprised. It was past 2 when he went to bed. So, the clock must be wrong, he thought. I can't have slept through a whole day and into another night. He looked at his watch, but it said 12 o'clock too. Perhaps it's midday, not midnight. But it is impossible that anything has happened to the sun, he said to himself. Then he jumped out of bed and went through the window. But the scene was empty, and there was nobody outside. The weather was dark and foggy, so he went to bed again. His mind was confused. He thought and thought it over, but he couldn't understand what was going on. He was worried, and he asked himself, was Marley's ghost a dream? But he knew that it seemed very real. Then he remembered the ghost's warning. It had warned him that a spirit would visit him at 1 o'clock. He decided to wait for the time to come in his bed. He had to stay awake until 1 o'clock had passed. The quarter of an hour passed slowly, then he continued listening to the bell. Ding dong. 1/2 past, said Scrooge. Ding dong. 1/4 to it, said Scrooge. Then nearly 15 minutes passed. It's 1 o'clock, said Scrooge joyfully, and nothing has happened. But he spoke before the hour bell had rung. At last he heard another ding dong. Suddenly a light shone into his bedroom. The curtains of his bed were pulled by a transparent hand, and Scrooge found himself face to face with his ghostly visitor. It was a strange figure. It was an old man, but it was as a small child. Its hair was long and white, but there wasn't any wrinkles in his face. Its skin was young and soft like a child. Its arms and hands were very long. It wore a white tunic, covered with both summer and winter flowers. But the strangest thing about it was the crown of its head. From the crown shone a bright light. This bright light made everything visible in the darkness. The belt of the ghost was sparkling. It was also carrying a hat under one arm, which looked like a big extinguisher. "Are you that spirit, sir?" asked Scrooge. "Yes, I am." "Who and what are you?" asked Scrooge. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" asked Scrooge, observing the strange figure of his visitor. "No, your past." "So tell me, spirit, why are you here?" "I'm here for your own good," said the ghost. Scrooge thought without saying anything. "I would prefer to sleep. That would be more useful to me." The spirit heard him thinking and said gently, "I came here to help you, my friend. You have to listen to me." It held Scrooge by the arm with its strong hand and said, "Come with me, and I'll show you something about your past." Scrooge did not want to refuse, so he got out of bed and said nothing. Finally he said, "I am a mortal, and if I fall I can die." "You will be safe," replied the ghost, and together they passed through the wall. They flew into the darkness. Scrooge instantly found himself standing on a country road. They had left foggy London. Now there were fields on both sides of the road. It was a clear winter day, with snow on the ground. He clasped his hands together and he cried delightedly, "Oh, I grew up in this place. I was a boy here. I remember it well." "Your lips are trembling," said the ghost. "And what is upon your cheek? Are you crying?" "No, nothing. Take me where you want." They passed along the fields and the roads together. Scrooge remembered every gate, every tree, until a little market town appeared with its church, its bridge, and its river. "It's strange that you've forgotten it for so many years," said the ghost, observing Scrooge's face. But Scrooge couldn't say anything. They saw some young schoolboys on horses, laughing and wishing each other Merry Christmas. They were traveling to their homes for the Christmas holiday. The fields were full of merry music. "These people are the shadows of the past. They are not children any more," said the ghost. Scrooge knew and named all of them. His cold eyes were shining with joy and happiness. But this time he was invisible, and nobody could see him. Why was he filled with gladness when he saw them wish each other Merry Christmas? Why did his frozen heart beat faster? What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? "The classroom is not empty. There is a lonely child sitting at his desk. His friends have all gone," said the ghost. Scrooge said he knew it, and he started to cry loudly. Soon they came into the school. They saw the child sitting lonely, reading a book near a small fire. Scrooge sat down at one of the desks, looked at his forgotten past self, and continued to cry. "What's the matter with you?" asked the ghost. "Poor boy, there was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have given him something, but I didn't give him anything. I'm so sorry," replied Scrooge. The ghost smiled thoughtfully, and he said, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge saw his past self again in the classroom. but this time he was a little older than before. The room was darker and dirtier. Young Scrooge was alone again, and he was walking up and down unhappily. Suddenly a little girl, much younger than the boy, came running in. She kissed him and cried, "Dear brother, I've come to bring you home." "Have you said home, little Fan?" returned the boy. "Yes," said the child. "Father is so much kinder than he used to be. I asked him if you could come home, and he accepted. You won't come back here again, but first we will be together all the Christmas long, and spend the merriest time." She clapped her hands and laughed delightedly, and the two children went out together, hand in hand. "She's a wonderful girl," said the ghost. "She also has a large heart." "That's true, Spirit. I can't deny it," replied Scrooge. "She married and had children before she died. Isn't it so?" "Yes, you are right, but she had only one child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew." Soon they left the school behind them. Now they were in a busy town, with shadowy crowds around them. It was Christmas time again, but it was evening. The streets and the shops were lit up. Suddenly, the ghost stopped at an office door and asked Scrooge, "Have you recognized this place?" "Yes," replied Scrooge. "I was a clerk here. I know this place." As they went in, Scrooge saw a tall man, and he cried in great excitement, "Oh, it's old Fezziwig! He's alive again!" Old Fezziwig put down his pen and looked at the clock. It was 7 o'clock. Then he called out in a deep and happy voice, "Ebenezer! Dick! Come here, my boys! No more work tonight! It's Christmas Eve! Ebenezer!" They put away all the pens and papers. Then they pulled all the furniture away from the center of the room, as their boss had told them. Soon a fiddler came in with his music book. The big office room was ready for the ball. After a while, the 3 Miss Fezziwigs came in, then many businessmen, then the baker, the milkman, and much more. The musicians started to play, and everybody had a good time at the Christmas ball. They were all dancing in pairs and enjoying this kind invitation. When they were all tired, Mr. Fezziwig shouted, "Now have something to eat and drink!" After they had eaten, they danced again happily. When the clock struck 11, Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their place on either side of the door. They shook hands with every person and wished them a Merry Christmas, one by one. They did the same to Dick and Ebenezer. During this whole time, Scrooge had watched the people dancing and had thought of his old days. Then the ghost looked at him, and the light on its head was much more brighter. "As you see, it's not that difficult to amuse these people," said the ghost. "Yes, you don't need so much money to make them happy," replied Scrooge. He was speaking like the young clerk he used to be. "Now I can see that our employer can make us happy with his looks and his words. They are so important for us. This feeling is much more important than money." Scrooge was not that cruel old man now, but suddenly he stopped speaking and started to think. "What's the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing, only I'd like to be able to say a few words to my clerk just now. That's all." Suddenly the place changed, and this time Scrooge saw himself older. His eyes were full of interest in money, but this was an unhealthy interest. His mouth looked thin, and his eyes were restless. His face showed the first signs of greed, but he was not alone in the room. A beautiful young girl was sitting by his side, and she was crying. "It matters little to you, very little," she said softly. "You love money and gold more than me." "There is nothing in the world as bad as poverty, you know. I haven't changed towards you, have I?" said Scrooge. "You've changed a lot. You are not that noble man whom I once loved and admired. I've come here to tell you that you are free. I can see that you don't want to marry me any more. I wish you happiness in the life that you have chosen." After these words, this pretty girl called Belle left him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "please show me no more. Take me home. All of this gives me pain." "Let us see one shadow more," replied the ghost. Suddenly the scene changed, and Scrooge saw a young girl sitting by the fire. He thought that she was Belle again, but soon he saw her, now a good-looking married lady. She was sitting with her beautiful daughter. The room was full of children. Belle and her children all seemed very happy. Then the doorbell rang, and the father came in. He was carrying big pockets and heavy bags. The children ran towards him for the Christmas presents. The younger ones hugged him round his neck. They all received their presents, then went to bed. Scrooge was watching this scene more attentively than ever. He became more sad when the children kissed their father again and again. He wondered how it would be to be a father. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Who was it?" "Guess who?" asked her husband. "I can't guess," said she. And he said, laughing, "Mr. Scrooge. I saw him sitting alone in his office. He had only a candle inside. I believe that he is quite alone in the world. Poor Mr. Scrooge." "Spirit," cried Scrooge, "please take me away from this place. I can't bear it any more." He was crying in tears. "Don't cry. These were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "So don't blame me. You chose the life that you are living now." Scrooge realized that the ghost wanted to show him more, so he wrestled with it. He cried, "Take me back and leave me. Don't torture me any longer." In the struggle, Scrooge observed that the light on the spirit's head was burning high and bright. So he took the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. He pressed it with all his force. The spirit disappeared under the extinguisher, but the light was so strong that it didn't disappear. It shone out from underneath the cap. In a few seconds, Scrooge found himself in his house, in his bedroom again. He was so tired that he climbed into bed. He couldn't think of the scenes he had seen, and he fell into a heavy sleep. Chapter 3. The Second of the Three Spirits. Scrooge woke up when the church bell struck 1. He prepared for the second ghost's arrival. He pulled every curtain aside with his own hands, then he waited in his bed. He was prepared for almost anything. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes passed, but nothing appeared. After a while, he saw a light coming out of the room and shining on his bed. So he got up, went to the door, and touched it. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name, told him to open the door and enter. Scrooge obeyed. When he entered, he saw that it was his own room, but it was different than it used to be. The walls and the ceiling were living green. There were small mirrors, decorative plants, berries, sausages, puddings, oysters, cheese nuts, cakes, meat, and much more. Everything seemed very delicious to Scrooge. His room was full of Christmas decorations and a feast. Then a giant ghost introduced himself. He was sitting and holding a torch in his hand. His torch was glowing and lightening all around the room. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better." Scrooge entered slowly and timidly. He behaved different than before. The spirit's eyes were kind and clear, but Scrooge didn't want to meet them. He was scared. "I'm the ghost of the Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look at me." It was dressed in a long green robe, and it had long dark brown curls falling down its back. From the torch that it was holding, a strong light shone. "Touch my robe," said the spirit. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "take me wherever you want. I saw so many things last night and learned a lesson. If you have to teach me more, you can do it." When he touched the spirit's robe, all the delicious and pretty things in the room disappeared. Scrooge found himself standing in the city streets on Christmas morning. The houses looked black, and the windows looked blacker. There was dirty snow on the roofs. The sky was misty, and the weather was foggy. But the people looked cheerful. They hurried to the bakers' shops to make everything ready for Christmas dinner. The spirit stopped in a baker's doorway with Scrooge. When it saw people pushing each other or getting angry, He dropped a few drops of water on them from its torch. Then, suddenly they became kinder. They wished each other Merry Christmas. The spirit liked to use its torch on the meals of the poor. "What do you do with this torch, Spirit?" asked Scrooge. "I make their Christmas dinners more tasteful," replied the spirit. "Can you add more taste to any kind of food?" "To a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because it needs the taste most," answered the spirit. Then the spirit took him to a small house where Scrooge's clerk lived. It was the modest house of Bob Cratchit. His family, dressed in its best clothing, was waiting for Bob to return from church. They were putting plates on the table for their Christmas dinner. Bob's son Peter was helping cook the meal, and two smaller Cratchits were running around happily. Their eldest daughter, Martha, arrived home from work before her father. "We're having a big chicken for dinner, Martha," shouted the two children. It was a small chicken, but it seemed big to them. "How late you are, my dear," said Mrs. Cratchit. "We had a lot of work to do, Mother," replied the girl. "Sit down by the fire and warm up yourself." "There's Father coming!" cried the two young Cratchits. "Hide, Martha, hide!" Martha hid herself, and in came Bob with his son Tiny Tim in his arms. The father was in his thin coat and long white scarf to warm himself on that snowy day. Tiny Tim had not walked since he was born. Poor boy, his limbs were supported by an iron frame. He was looking tired as he had not got enough strength. "Where's our Martha?" asked Bob, looking around. "She's not coming," replied his wife. "Not coming?" said Bob, looking very disappointed. Martha didn't like to see her father disappointed. It was only a joke, so she came out from behind the closet door and ran into her father's arms. Then they discussed Tiny Tim's good heart and his growing strength. When Bob said that his son was getting better, his voice was trembling. The two young Cratchits showed Tiny Tim the chicken. Soon they sat down to eat. They were all very hungry and ate every bit of it. "I've never tasted a better chicken before," said Bob Cratchit. All the family agreed with him, shaking their heads. There was a better surprise waiting for them. Mrs. Cratchit brought the pudding in. "Oh, a wonderful pudding!" cried Bob. His wife laughed like a young girl. Everybody had something to say, but nobody said it or thought it was a small pudding for a large family. When they finished their meal, the children washed the plates. They ate apples and oranges, sitting round the fire. While the chestnuts were on the fire, cracking noisily, Bob said, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears." All the family repeated this wish. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat to his father's side. Bob held Tim's little hand to his and wished to keep him by his side. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "please tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see an empty seat. I'm sorry, but if the future doesn't change, the child will die." "Oh, no," replied Scrooge. "Kind Spirit, say he will be saved." "If these shadows do not change, the child will die before next Christmas," said the spirit, and it added, "There are too many people in the world, so what does that matter if some of them die?" The spirit had repeated Scrooge's words, so the old man was ashamed, but he raised his head when he heard his name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob, "let's drink to him as we bought this meal with his money." "With his money?" cried Mrs. Cratchit, blushing with anger. "Why should we drink to the health of that mean and bad old man? He only pays you 15 shillings a week. It's not enough to feed a family." "Please, my dear," said Bob, "it's Christmas Day. Don't talk like that among the children." "I'll drink for his health if you want. It's Christmas, so long life to him. But nobody knows him better than you, my poor husband," answered Mrs. Cratchit. Scrooge's name was like a bad cloud over the family. It was like a dark shadow on the party. Only 5 minutes later one could say a word. But it had passed away, and they were 10 times happier than before. Although they were a poor family, their clothes were old and their shoes were not waterproof. They were happy, grateful, and pleased with one another. Tiny Tim was singing songs with his little voice, and he was singing very well. Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until he left the Cratchits' house with the spirit. It was getting dark and snowing heavily. They went along the streets and saw the fires in kitchens, delicious meals on the tables, and well-decorated Christmas houses. They saw people welcoming their families and friends into their homes. Every house was expecting company. Then the ghost took Scrooge away from the city center. They flew over the land and then over the sea. Scrooge was frightened. "Where are we going?" he asked the spirit. But there was no answer, so he held the spirit's rope strongly. It was stormy and windy weather. Soon he found himself in a lighthouse built on a lonely rock. This place was several miles away from land. It had been built in order to warn sailors of the dangerous rocks. Scrooge saw two men sitting in this cold place, but they were happy. Although they were away from their families, they were shaking hands and wishing each other a Merry Christmas. Then the spirit took him on a ship. Here all the sailors were happy, and they were singing Christmas carols. They were also far away from home, but each one was thinking of his family. Scrooge heard the sound of the wind and the waves. He was surprised with all of these happy people. Their happy laughs reminded him of his nephews. Then suddenly he found himself in a bright room. He was in his nephew's house. The spirit was smiling behind him. "Ha ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "There is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor." So all the people around him laughed too. "He said that Christmas was a humbug," cried Scrooge's nephew. His pretty wife was standing next to him. "He's a good man, but also a strange old man," added he. "He is not so pleasant, that's the truth, but I'm sorry for him." "Why are you sorry for him?" his wife asked. "I'm sure he is very rich, Fred. His money can't give him happiness. He is so lonely. He must be sitting in his cold room. I think it's a nice idea to invite him every Christmas. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. I'll invite him again the next Christmas. Perhaps one day he'll accept my invitation," replied Fred. "I think he loses a very good dinner," said his young wife. Everybody else said the same. "I was only going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that I think he loses some pleasant moments." After tea, they had some music. They were a musical family. Fred played so well on the harp. While Scrooge was listening to Fred's music, he remembered the scenes which were shown to him by the ghost of Christmas past. His heart was softened. But they didn't play music all night long. After a while, they decided to play games. They began to play a guessing game. Scrooge also joined in the games, though they didn't notice his ghostly presence. Scrooge often guessed the right answer, but nobody could hear him except the spirit. The spirit was pleased to find him in this mood. He was like a little boy, playing games and having fun with the people. He begged like a boy to stay there until the guests left the house, but the spirit didn't accept that. "But here is a new game," said Scrooge. "Only half an hour more, please." It was a game called Yes and No. Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. Fred only would answer to their questions yes or no. After several questions, Scrooge heard that his nephew's question was an animal, sometimes a wild and an angry animal, which lived in London and walked about the streets. At last, his wife's beautiful sister cried out, "I can guess the right answer!" She was laughing loudly. "What is it?" asked Fred. "It's your uncle, Scrooge!" The answer was right. All of them laughed like the pretty sister. They laughed until they cried. Then Fred said suddenly, "He has given us a happy Christmas, so let's drink to his health. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to my old uncle!" They all lifted their glasses and cried, "To Uncle Scrooge!" Scrooge felt so happy, and he wanted to thank all of them. But the spirit didn't give him time. It pulled him away from the games to a number of other Christmas scenes. They left the happy crowd and continued on their travels. They visited many different places, many people living in poverty, children, hospitals, and old people, but always with a happy end. It was a long night for poor old Scrooge. When he looked at the spirit, he noticed that its hair was gray and it was getting older. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life in this world ends at midnight tonight, and I have only 15 minutes, said the spirit. Scrooge had seen a strange thing under the spirit's robe, so he asked, "Forgive me, but I see something near your foot. Is it a foot or a claw?" It brought out of its skirt a boy and a girl. They were ghostly figures. "Look down here," said the ghost. The children were thin, and they had yellow skin. Their face showed only a frightening hate. "Spirit, are they yours?" said Scrooge in fear. He had never seen anything so sad. "They are man's. The boy is ignorance. The girl is want. They are both harmful for a human being. They will destroy them if people do nothing about them," said the spirit sadly. "Have they no refuge or a home?" asked Scrooge. "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" answered the ghost, with Scrooge's previous words. The bell struck 12, and the ghost disappeared. But soon Scrooge saw a new ghost, coming like a mist toward him. Chapter 4. The Last of the Spirits. The ghost silently approached him. It was wearing a long black robe, and it had a tall figure. The robe was covering its head and body. Then it came close to Scrooge and stopped. It was difficult to separate it from the darkness. Everything around was black. This third spirit was the most mysterious of all. Soon after, the ghost pointed onward with its hand. "Are you the ghost of Christmas yet to come?" asked Scrooge. His voice was shaking as he was really afraid this time. The spirit did not answer, but it pointed again onward with its hand. "Are you going to show me shadows of the things that have not happened yet, but will happen in the future?" asked Scrooge one more time. "Is that so, spirit?" The spirit answered Scrooge's questions with silence and wanted him to follow. For the first time, he was so frightened. The ghost was so silent, and its color was so dark, that Scrooge's legs trembled. Its ghostly eyes were fixed upon him. "Ghost of the future!" he cried decidedly. "You frighten me a lot, but I think you can change my life. I want to be another man. I want to change my life, and I think you can help me. I'll be very thankful to you if you show me the future," said Scrooge, and begged. "The time is passing so fast. The time is valuable to me. Please show me the way." The ghost moved away, carrying Scrooge along. He followed the shadow of its huge black dress. They instantly appeared in the heart of the city. They were standing among some businessmen. The ghost pointed to one small group of men with his hand, so they approached the group. Scrooge started to listen to their conversation. They were jokingly discussing someone's death. "No," said a fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it. I only know he's a dead man now." "When did he die?" asked another man. "Last night, I suppose." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked the third man. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first, yawning. "I don't care." "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Perhaps he left the company. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." All of them laughed at this answer. Then one of them said, "I think it will be a very cheap funeral. I don't know of anybody to go to it." They laughed again. Scrooge wondered why the ghost was showing him these conversations, but the spirit didn't explain anything. Suddenly it raised its hand and pointed to two gentlemen meeting. They looked as if they were two rich businessmen. Scrooge listened again, and thought that the explanation might lie there. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" answered the other. "Well," said the first, "the old man has died at last." "They've told me about it," replied the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "It's a cold Christmas day. Good morning." That was their meeting, conversation, and parting. They didn't speak any more. Scrooge wondered what kind of effect these conversations would have on his future. The dead man could not be his partner Jacob, as he was already dead. He searched for his own shadow, but he could not see his shadow among the crowd. He was surprised, but he said to himself, "If I change my life, I won't be the same person as I am. I will be totally different in the future. That's why I can't see my own shadow." Suddenly he realized that the spirit was standing beside him. This time its hand was pointing another place. Scrooge felt very cold, and he started to shake. They left the busy crowd and went to another part of the city. Scrooge had never been there before. The ways were dirty and narrow. The people were drunken and ugly. He could smell the dirt upon the streets. Finally, the spirit and Scrooge stopped in front of the small shop. A man was sitting inside the shop, waiting for the customers. He was selling old furniture and clothes to the poorest people of London. Then 3 women arrived at the shop. They arrived at the same time, and each was carrying a large bundle. They were astonished to see each other. Then they all laughed. "You are in the best place to meet," said old Joe. "Come in and open them. I want to see what you have got for me." Then the first woman threw her bundle on the table and looked at the other 2 boldly. "Who cares what people think of me? They might know where these come from. I must think of myself." "He always did so." "That's right," said the laundress. "What do you think? Does a dead man need these things?" said the first woman. "We washed for him, we cooked for him, and did everything for him. Look what we got. Nothing." "Nothing indeed," said the laundress. "If he had been a good man, we would have had somebody to look after him. But he was all alone by himself, lying in his bed." "He was a bad man. He was also very cruel. We only got 3 shillings a week. I think it's a judgment for him," said the second. "Now open the bundle, Joe. Let's see what we have here." Joe looked at inside the bundles, and he got surprised. Boots, a pencil case, a brooch of no great value, a pair of buttons, and some silver spoons, said he to the second woman. Then he continued to examine the next bundle. "Sheets and towels, 2 old silver teaspoons, and a few boots," said Joe, feeling the fine cotton. "That's your account, and I can't give you another penny." It was the first woman's turn. "I always give too much to ladies," added the old man, murmuring, "It's my weakness." Then he opened the bundle. There was a heavy roll of some dark stuff in it. "What do you call this?" said Joe. "Bed curtains?" "Ah," returned the woman, "bed curtains." Joe was astonished. "You don't mean to say you took them down while he was lying there?" asked he. "Yes, I did," answered the woman decidedly, "and this was his best shirt. When he died, they put it on him, but he doesn't need the shirt, the curtains, and blankets any more, so I took them." She laughed with the other women. Then the second woman said, "He frightened us, and he was very cruel when he was alive. It's no sin to sell his blankets or curtains now. Be careful, and don't drop that oil upon the blankets now. Ha, ha, ha!" As he listened to the conversation, Scrooge felt himself sick, and whispered, "Spirit!" And he added, I see that this unhappy man might be my own. What is this? Will I die that way?" Suddenly he touched a bed, because the scene had changed again. This was a bare and uncurtained bed. The room was so dark that Scrooge could not see anything. He felt with his hand that something was lying on the bed. It was covered up with a sheet. Then a pale light fell straight upon the bed where the dead man was lying. Scrooge looked at the man without seeing his face and said, "Poor man, he has no friends. Nobody loves him. He is robbed of his clothes. I can't see flowers or candles around him. Money can't buy happiness. It can't buy a peaceful death either." Scrooge felt himself so bad that he begged the spirit to go. "This is a terrible place. I don't want to stay here any more. Please take me away from here." But the spirit pointed at the man's head, and it was standing still. Scrooge said, "I understand you, but I have no power. I can't look at his face." And he added, "If there's any person who feels anything because of this man's death, please show him to me. He wanted to know if anybody was affected by this death. Suddenly, the spirit spread his black robe like a wing and showed a room to Scrooge. There was a mother sitting in the room with her children. She was waiting for someone, walking up and down the room. She was looking out anxiously from the window. Finally, her husband came in, and she ran to meet him. Then they sat down to the dinner, and she asked her husband, "What's the latest news about him? Is it good or bad?" He wanted to say something to her, but he was ashamed to be happy with the news. He didn't know how to say. "Bad," he answered. "Are we totally ruined?" she asked. "No, there's still hope. Caroline." "Hope for us? I don't think so. If this bad, mean old man wants us to pay back the money, we can't. You know that we haven't got enough money to pay our debt, so they will send us to prison." "Don't worry, Caroline. He's dead." "Oh, thank God for this. I'm thankful to him with all my heart," she said. But in a few seconds she was ashamed of her words, and she said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say that." "I don't know to whom we will pay our debt later, but before that time I will be ready with the money, so we can sleep well tonight," replied the husband. That night their house was full of happiness. The children's faces were brighter for this man's death, although they little understood who he was. But Scrooge was so sad to see this scene. He said to the spirit, "I have only seen happiness at this man's death. Now please show me some tenderness connected with the death." So the ghost took him through several streets. Scrooge looked everywhere to find himself, but he couldn't see his shadow anywhere. Then they entered poor Bob Cratchit's house. The mother and the children were sitting round the fire. They were all quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were like statues in one corner. They were standing still. It seemed strange to Scrooge. The mother and her daughters were sewing a cloth for Bob. After a while she laid her work upon the table and said, "The color hurt my eyes." "The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim." Then she continued, "They're better now. The candlelight makes them weak, and I don't want to show weak eyes to your father when he comes home. He must be about to come." "He is late," said Peter to his mother, "but I think he has walked a little slower these last few days than he used to." After a long silence, Cratchit's wife said bravely, "I've known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed." "And so have I," said Peter. The other little Cratchits agreed with their mother. "But he was very light to carry, and don't forget that your father loved him so much. And there's your father at the door now," said Mrs. Cratchit, and ran to the door to meet him and give him a kiss. Poor Bob looked tired and thin. His daughters brought him a cup of tea and helped him take his boots and scarf off. The children sat around their father and looked at him with consolating eyes. Bob was very happy with them. Then he looked upon the table and saw the little shirt made for him. He was pleased with this present. He thanked his wife and his daughters. Suddenly he said, "I can wear it before Sunday, can't I?" "Sunday? You went today, Bob," cried his wife. "Yes, my dear," said he, with a soft, trembling voice, "but it's a wonderful green place. I wish you could have gone too. But I promised him that I would walk there on every Sunday. My little child!" Then he began to cry, saying, "My little child!" After a while he left the room and went upstairs into the room above. He sat close beside the child. He thought for a while. When he felt calmer, he kissed Tiny Tim's little face and went down again quite happy. They all sat about the fire and talked. The girls and mother were still working to finish the little shirt. Then Bob told them about the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew. "I've met him today," said Bob. "He was very kind to me, and he said he had been very sorry for it, and for my good wife. He knew that you are a good wife." "Everybody knows that, Father," cried Peter. "Well, my boy, I hope they do. Mr. Scrooge's nephew also told me to come to his house whenever I wanted. He gave me his card. He seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim, and felt with us." "I'm sure he has a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "My dears," Bob said to his children, "one day you will marry and leave home. but I'm sure that you will never forget Tiny Tim, will you?" "Never, Father!" they all cried. "And I know," said Bob, "that we will always remember how kind and patient he was, although he was a little child. We shall not forget him." "No, never, Father!" they all cried again. "I'm very happy," said Bob. "I'm very happy to hear this from you." Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters and his little sons kissed him, and he and Peter shook hands. Poor Bob had felt himself better when he discussed Tiny Tim's lasting memory. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "I know that soon we'll leave this house and pass to another place, or you'll leave me and go away. But I have a question for you. Please tell me who that man on the bed was." The spirit didn't say anything. It only brought him to Scrooge's office door. "Let me see how I will look in the future," cried the old man decidedly. "Wait a moment." The spirit stopped, but its hand was pointing away from the office. Scrooge went to the window, but he couldn't see himself inside. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture had changed, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The ghost of Christmas yet to come pointed its fingers as before, and took Scrooge to an iron gate. He looked around before entering. They had reached a church, and they had entered the churchyard. Here, among the untidy graves and the uncut grass, was the grave of a miserable man whose name Scrooge would soon learn. The ghost stood by a grave and pointed down at it without moving. Scrooge, before looking at it, asked the ghost, "Tell me now, are these the shadows of the things that will be or may be?" He believed that those were the shadows of the things that may be, but the ghost said nothing. The old man got closer to the grave. As he went, he was trembling. At last he read the stone. It was his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. He realized he was the dead man from before. "Am I that man who was lying on the bed, covered with a blanket?" he cried, shaking upon his knees. "No, spirit, oh no, I have changed a lot. I'm not that old mean man that I used to be." For the first time, his hands were trembling with fear. "Good spirit, tell me that I have a chance to change my future. I only need one more chance." The kind hand trembled again. "I will give great importance to Christmas. I will always remember the past and the present, and I will think of the future. I have learnt much from the lessons of the three ghosts. It will be a kind, happy man from now on," he begged. "I only need a chance to clean away the writing on this stone." Scrooge caught the ghostly hand tight, but the spirit was stronger than him, so it pulled his hand away. The old man was helpless and full of fear, but when he saw the ghost getting smaller and smaller, he was scared to death. The ghost became so small that suddenly it became a bedpost. Chapter 5. The End of the Story. Yes, the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own, and the room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the future was his own, and he could change his life. "I will think of the past, the present, and the future," Scrooge repeated, as he got out of bed hurriedly. "Oh, Jacob Marley, God bless you and Christmas!" He could hardly speak. His face was wet with tears, and suddenly he started to shout, "Here are my bed curtains! They aren't stolen, and I'm here, still alive!" He was putting his hands on his clothes all this time, trying to realize that the nightmare was over. "I don't know what to do," cried Scrooge. He was laughing and crying at the same time. "I'm as light as a feather, as happy as an angel, and as merry as a schoolboy. A Merry Christmas to everybody!" He continued to speak as he ran in the room. "There's the door which Jacob's ghost came through. There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. It's all true, and it all happened. Ha ha ha!" For a man who hadn't laughed for so many years, it was a splendid laugh. He went on laughing for a few minutes. Then he said to himself, "I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I have been among the ghosts. I'm like a baby. I don't know anything. Never mind. I prefer to be a baby than that old, mean, and cruel man." Then he heard church bells ring. They were ringing louder than ever. Running to the window, he opened it and saw that there was no frost and no fog. The day was clear, bright, and there was a golden sunlight. He ran outside and asked a boy, "What's today?" The boy was surprised. "Today?" replied the boy. "Why, it's Christmas Day." "It's Christmas Day?" said Scrooge to himself. "I haven't missed it. The spirits have come in only one night. They can do it because they can do anything they like." "Hello, young fellow," he said to the boy again. "Do you know the butcher on the corner of the next street?" "Yes, I know," answered the boy. "You are an intelligent boy. Do you know if they've sold the big turkey? Not the little one, the big one." "The one as big as me?" asked the boy. "Yes, you're right. What an intelligent boy you are. It's so nice to talk to you." "No, sir, it's still in the shop window." "Well, go and buy it. Tell the man to bring the turkey here. If you come here with the man, I'll give you a shilling. If you come back in less than 5 minutes, I'll give you 3 shillings. The boy ran like a bullet. "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's," he whispered. "He won't know who is the sender." Then he wrote the address to give to the butcher's man. He thought that the turkey was twice as big as Tiny Tim. Now his heart was full of happiness, and he was laughing. He also paid for the taxi, because the turkey was too heavy to carry all the way long. Then he wore his best clothes and went out into the streets. He had seen the shadows of those people with the ghost of Christmas present. Scrooge looked very pleasant and smiled at all the people. 3 or 4 of them said, "Good morning, sir, and a Merry Christmas to you." These words were the best sounds for him. While he was walking, he saw the portly gentleman who had asked him for a charitable donation the day before. "My dear sir," said Scrooge, and he took the old gentleman's hands to shake. "How do you do?" asked Scrooge. "Mr. Scrooge?" said the portly gentleman. "Yes," said Scrooge, "that's my name, and I want to tell you that I'm sorry for yesterday. Will you please let me—" and he whispered in his ears. "God bless you!" cried the gentleman. He could hardly speak. "Don't say anything, please," said Scrooge decidedly. "Come and see me. Will you come and see me?" "I will," replied the old gentleman happily. Then Scrooge continued to walk through the city. He went to the church. He watched the people hurrying and gave children money for sweets. He looked down into the kitchens of houses. Everything around gave him happiness. In the afternoon he walked to his nephew's house. He talked happily with everyone he met. He passed the door of his nephew's house a dozen times until he had enough courage to knock on the door. At last he did. "Is your master at home?" said Scrooge to the girl. "Yes, sir," replied she. "Where is he, my dear?" "He's in the dining room. I'll show you upstairs." Fred and his young wife were waiting for their friends to arrive. They liked to see that everything was right. "Fred," said Scrooge, standing at the door, "I've come to dinner. Will you invite me in, Fred?" Fred shook his uncle's arm strongly. He was as pleased as his old uncle. Scrooge felt at home in a couple of minutes. They played games, and the old man had a wonderful time at the party. He was early at his office next morning. He wanted to be there earlier than Bob, and he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 9:15. No Bob. He came 18½ minutes late when he finally arrived. Scrooge sat with his door wide open. He wanted Bob to see him waiting. "Hallo," said Scrooge angrily. "What do you mean by coming here at this time?" "I'm really sorry, sir," answered Bob, taking his hat off his head and his long scarf off his neck. "You must be sorry," said Scrooge in his old voice. "But, sir, it's once in a year. We had a Merry Christmas yesterday," answered Bob. "Now I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge, jumping off his chair. "A Merry Christmas, Bob! I'm totally changed. I'm going to pay you twice as much." Bob thought that his boss had gone crazy. Poor Cratchit's face went white, but it was clear that Scrooge meant it. "I'll give you a merrier Christmas, my good fellow, than I've given you for many years. I'll raise your salary and help your family. Let's discuss it this afternoon, my friend. Put more wood on the fire, Bob. Let's celebrate Christmas together." Scrooge did what he had promised. He was even better than his word. He helped the Cratchits and other people who needed help. Tiny Tim did not die, and Scrooge was a second father to him. Soon he was known as a good friend, a good master, and a good man by everyone. Some people laughed to see the change in him, but he let them laugh. His own heart was laughing, and that was enough for Scrooge. He never saw the spirits again, but he knew how to keep Christmas well. He lived a long, happy life with all his friends around him, and that is what we all want. As Tiny Tim said, God bless us, everyone.